Get started here. Thank you to everybody for joining us. We've got a lot of folks registered and still flowing in throughout. So really happy to have you in the webinar today. As you join, we have just a couple of questions that we're going to post here as a little bit of a poll, and we'll come back to this in the Q&A. But we want to know how you feel the protests will either affect your institution's reputation or enrollment, which obviously are going to be things that we're talking about throughout the course of the discussion today. So Carrie has added those here to the poll and to the chat. If you can take some time, we'll come back and revisit that. We know that for many of you, campus climate and all of the issues since October 7th have been, a nonstop challenge. And, a lot of our clients and a lot of folks in higher education are talking about a world before and after those incidents in the same way that we sort of refer to things being pre-COVID. And so we know that there have been, whether it's the protests, whether it's some of the testimonials on Capitol Hill and the parade of university administrators and leaders and chancellors that have been in the media or in the political spotlight. We know that we've had so many of our clients and so many folks throughout higher education dealing with these issues and wondering how they would impact their brand, their enrollment, and what that effect might be in the long-term future for their institutions. We also had tactical things kind of that were coming up through our work. Folks asking us if they should pause any of the brand work that they were doing right now, or any of the market research work that they might be doing with their campus. Should they be pausing their advertising or their digital marketing? How should they be communicating with alumni and current students? And those kinds of things are always really tough and difficult to answer. There's not real definitive, clear things that you should always do, but it really, really got us kind of thinking more broadly about the types of things that the industry was facing. And we wanted to understand how much people were, paying attention to all of the issues that surrounded the protests, but also the impact on trust of higher education, which schools were being associated with the issues, and which ones were coming to mind, and how it was impacting decisions about going to college in the future. Things around broader reputation issues. So we've done a lot of research for schools around crisis and major issues in the past, but this seemed to be one of those opportunities to really look at how a singular set of incidents rolled up to higher education's reputation overall. And we hypothesized that this might just be another issue that is kind of beginning to further erode trust in higher education, or worse, that it may lead to continued declines in enrollment or other institutional challenges. So we've got some great data that we are prepared to share with you. I'm excited to be joined by two amazing experts with a lot of vast experience in reputational and crises issues. First, Carol Keese is the Vice President of Communications at the University of Oregon. She's been in that role since December of 2023. And prior to that, spent more than a decade at UVA and the UVA health system. She has held multiple marketing communications roles throughout higher education and healthcare, and is just one of the smartest and brightest folks that work in our industry. So Carol, thank you for joining us. Teresa Valerio Parrot is the founder and principal at TVP Communications, a strategic communications firm that works with colleges and universities on media relations, thought leadership, strategic counsel, crisis and reputational issues. She's also currently the co-chair of the AMA Symposium for the Marketing of Higher Education, which we know is an event that many of you attend. And she, if you have not listened, is the co-host of the Trusted Voices podcast. So Teresa, happy to have you and nice to see you both as always. A couple of folks from the SimpsonScarborough team that I want to acknowledge: Carrie Barnett, our Director of Marketing, and Meredith Simpson, our VP of Industry Research, are also both here and active in the chat, answering questions, providing a little bit of direction for you all, and we'll be able to help in following up. Both have been super, super helpful in both this study and this webinar, as well as other folks from across the Simpson-Scarborough team. So thank you all for all that hard work, and we're going to dive right in. Okay, so we always like to start our webinars with giving you the details about who we surveyed, how we did it, what it looks like. We had more than 1,600 respondents to our survey, which was fielded working with a protege panel. We were in the field in late May and closed out in early June and worked really quickly to bring some analysis to you. We had 641 high school students who self-identified, and that's kind of a little bit of a weird time in the school year. So they self-identified as either a junior or senior in high school. All of them had some plans for college. Nearly 80% of them were planning to attend a four-year institution. We had 1,000 parents that responded. 81% of those parents had a college degree or an advanced degree. So I think that's interesting from a demographic standpoint, folks that are kind of keenly attuned to higher education and have degrees themselves. We had representative samples by geography, by race and ethnicity, by political affiliation, by some other factors as well. For the most part, we did not see a whole lot of significant differences from respondents on some of those secondary factors, except for political affiliation, which we will spend some time talking about. We do have some of those other breakdowns, but again, if you have a question on one of those things and want to follow up, we can give that detail. We probably will not cover a whole lot of those because there were not a whole lot of secondary factors that were really, really important. So with that, I want to move kind of just to our main theme, and that is that the campus protests and Capitol Hill testimony were not just news events. Prospective students and especially their parents were really paying attention. So we wanted to just understand how much these issues were really on people's radars. Was this just higher ed, focused on higher ed? Were we operating a bit in a little bit of a vacuum? But the reality is that a lot of parents in particular were really paying very close attention to these issues and the things that were happening on campus. 42% of parents reported a high level of familiarity. 3 out of 4 parents reported being familiar with the protest. That's a lot. And nearly 60% of prospects reported having some or a high level of familiarity with the protests as well. You can see here that general familiarity turned into 9 in 10 parents saying that they could recall at least one campus where a protest had occurred. But nearly 7 in 10 could name 3 or more schools specifically. So, that I think was a really, really interesting point. 57% of prospects reported being able to name 3 or more schools as well. When we looked then, what we did is we gave each of the parents and students space to name in an open-end field up to 3 schools that they could identify as being associated with some of these campus issues. And I'll tell you that the average number of entries for parents was 2.9. So almost every parent could name 3 schools. There were over 2,900 names, schools that were named by parents in total. Nationally, though, there were really just 3 schools that consistently came up as being associated with the protests. That was Columbia, Harvard, and UCLA. For parents, Columbia really stood out. But you can see that for students, Columbia, Harvard, and UCLA were relatively equal in the amount of times that they were being mentioned. This was an open field, so parents and students could write in the name of the institution. So you'll see that in a few cases here, like the University of California reference that's here, that could have been UC Berkeley. It could have been one of the other UC campuses. But it's, in this case, broadly lumped into a broader set of all of the UC schools. That being said, you can see in this particular case, UCLA also being, one of the top 3, UC Berkeley being referenced. I think it's with the prospects, you can see UC San Diego there. So there is some of this is a little bit of scale. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the panel discussion, but obviously not all of these schools on this list had significant issues on their campuses. And in some ways, this is a proxy for some of the country's biggest university brands. It's notable that many of the schools on this list are also in big, major metropolitan urban media markets. And so we're sure that that drives some of the list of names of the institutions that are being referenced. Just keep in mind that, similar to when Ivy League schools are highlighted in the media or called to testify or asked to be representative, these are the schools that are driving then the broader brand perception of higher education as an industry. In part, that's why they become such easy targets for kind of the political theater that we all saw. Meanwhile, there were some schools that had significant issues on their campus, like Emory, where police intervened, or Indiana University, where there were snipers on tops of buildings, or even regional campuses like Cal Poly Humboldt, where there were occupations, there were of campus buildings that led to, excuse me, major stories and major media publications like the New York Times. None of those schools were mentioned more than 2%. You're not seeing any of those schools on this list. And I think that's really telling, right? There was a lot of media coverage, but really, these incidents are really being associated primarily with the three schools at the top of the list. If we looked at individual schools' prospect lists, or we tested things among some certain larger major metros just within those geographies, I think some of the names of these schools may change or be a little bit different. That I think is what we're looking at here is really just a national response to the issues overall. I know that there are some folks that are on this call from some of these top 3 to 5 schools, or others of you that may have specific questions about your school in particular. Feel free to reach out to us and we can follow up one-on-one with you about some of the things that we saw deeper in the data. And in some cases, if we have some representative numbers, we're happy to actually share with you how many times your institution was mentioned, if that was significant. So feel free to reach out to us after the webinar. There's really a sharp difference in how the protests have impacted trust and opinion of higher education. Almost half of the respondents, both parents and prospects, are saying that the protests decreased their trust in higher ed. But we can also see here that around 35% of respondents said that the protests had no impact at all. So only focusing on that, though, kind of leaves out the long tail of what's happening from a reputational and a broader industry perspective. Almost 20% of parents said that it decreased their trust significantly. And so that's a really, really big number. 47% said it decreased it overall. And similarly, prospects reported a total of a 47% decrease. So there really is, significant impact on trust in higher education. And I think those of us in this industry are already keenly aware that this is really, really critical and one of those things that we face as an industry as a whole. The impact on the perceptions, I mean, one of the things that was really interesting was after we asked them about higher education generally, we then asked them how it affected their trust of the schools that they had listed in that open end. And while the protests don't strongly impact their prospective students' general perception of higher ed, they do have a significant negative impact on the perception of those campuses that they heard of related to the protests. So you can see that big difference here. We aggregated responses on those schools, and then you can see the totals here. So 26% of prospects say that the protests had a significant negative impact on their opinions of those schools that they listed, right? And nearly 70% of them said it had a negative impact overall. For parents, they reported feeling more negative towards those individual schools, and fewer reported it having no impact on their perception of those schools at all. So, pretty big decrease on that no impact part. And again, really, really being focused on the schools that they associate, and keep in mind it was consistently those three schools that we mentioned before. 26% of parents said it had a significant impact on their opinions of those schools, compared to just 19% on higher education as an industry or higher education overall. While the protests are kind of impacting overall perceptions, we still see that there remains a high interest in attending college. This is fairly consistent with some of the other broader reputational and trust studies that have been done related to higher education, whether those have been with Morning Consult or other folks previously. Around 50% of parents and prospects said that the protests would not impact their students' interest in attending college or their interest in attending college. However, again, we can see some chipping away of some of that. So roughly a third of parents and prospects say that it's decreased their interest, and that's not insignificant in any way. We did have an open-ended question here where we asked why it decreased their perception or why it decreased their interest. And, the easiest way to sort of summarize that is concerns around campus safety. So, literally their ability to feel safe, to be safe going to classes, and those kind of things is just pushing down that overall feeling around campus safety. So in the next few minutes, I think we want to move into something that, again, this sort of is parallel to some of those other broader higher education studies, but the story gets a lot more complex when we start to look at the findings by political affiliation, political belief. And so when we look at things by political affiliation for parents, we can see that there is much higher decline in trust for Republican parents. So not only are 67% of Republican parents saying that the protests decrease their trust in higher ed, but you can see that 33%, compared to just 10% for Democratic parents, say it significantly decreased their trust, right? So that's a really, really big difference. 22% of independents also say that the protests significantly decreased their trust. And then when we look specifically about the campuses they cited, again, just like we saw in the other study, the numbers are even higher when we ask about those specific campuses that they reference. So 50% of Republican parents say that the protests had a significant impact on their view of those institutions, almost 3 times higher than the number of Democratic parents. And the number was almost 80% overall. So meanwhile, only 16% of Republican parents said that it had no impact on their perception of those schools. Last kind of chart that we want to show to you here, you can see that Republican parents are about 3 times more likely than Democratic parents to say that protests decrease their interest in having their child attend college. However, nearly half of them report that it will not have any impact on that interest in any way. Okay. So the kind of key takeaways that we want to move to are that we want to leave you with are first, parents and students did have high levels of awareness with the protests. But generally, they associate those protests with 3 to 5 schools at most. For those schools, moving from kind of the reputational hit will be something that needs to be studied and understood deeply. Will really need to be monitored, continue to be researched, and those brands really are going to have to do some close some close analysis of some of that impact, both reputationally and substantively for those institutions. Second, interest in attending still seems that it may be somewhat impacted, but how immediate that enrollment impact is a little bit unclear. Just remember that this survey was kind of coming very late in the recruitment cycle. And I think that there are other things, other issues like the FAFSA debacle or concern on, rising costs that are likely to have greater impact than some in the near term than some of the issues surrounding the protests. And then last point here, finally, every issue, this is just the latest, as you all know, in a series of things, is just continuing to just broaden this divide between Republicans and Democrats around the sentiment towards higher education. And overall, these issues are really having a cumulative effect on higher education overall. So let's see. As we shift now to kind of our Q&A, I first want to get myself oriented and make sure that I see here. So we wanted to let you know a couple of the responses that we got, or the responses that we got from you about a couple of the things that we polled. 53% of you in attendance are concerned that your institution's reputation could be more negative or impacted negatively because of protest issues or surrounding issues on your campus. So 53% of you. And 32% of you are concerned about it impacting enrollment. 45% are not, and 23% are not sure, right? So if it will have an impact or not. So with that, get my little notes here up. I'm anxious to bring Carol and Teresa into the conversation, and thank you again for joining us today. Teresa, I'd love to start with you, just opening up and hearing a little bit of kind of your initial reactions to the data and the findings, and specifically kind of what are your thoughts about the implications here for leaders in the higher ed space, both marketing communications professionals as well as broader university leadership.
So Jason, thank you to you and to SimpsonScarborough for doing this research, because many of us have been wondering what the protests and encampments and their coverage would mean for our industry and for our institutions. And I have 3 quick immediate observations. The first is that I would encourage all of us to take a deep breath. I want to note that the data points show that we have some real work to do, and I think that's important. So let's make sure we are looking at what that work is. And I love to assert a positive, so I want to point out that not everyone was paying attention. All of us in higher education have been hyper-fixated on campus protests, as we all should be, but not everyone has. And as a result, we need to stop leading our conversations from a defensive position. The second is I want us all to recognize that these results are just for 2, you can kind of combine them into 1 of our many audiences. To be honest, I'm more worried about what surveys of our current students, faculty, staff, and alumni will say, because they have really clear expectations for us to live our missions, and they will be judging our performances over the past year based on our brand promises and the expectations that they have for campus culture. So these are the audiences that I think we also need to be focused on, so that their perceptions are reinforced if they're positive, or if needed, are reversed for prospective students and their families. And then the third is, right now is the perfect time for all of us to think about what we'll do with that data. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, I know, Jason, from your questions. But to be clear, I don't think that this is a communications issue, even though many are trying to simplify what happened and what needs to be done through a communications lens. This is a leadership, a value of higher education, values, trust, and safety conversation. In Marcom, we participate in the shaping and dissemination of information. And now is the time that our success is really based on how our campus leaders choose to make decisions and build or rebuild relationships. And that's not a communications problem. I do believe, though, that communications is foundational to that solution. So let me close with this. Just about a year ago, a philosopher provided us with a guiding question that I think applies to where we are today. And in the wise words of Billie Eilish, we should all be asking ourselves, what was I made for? And for me, that means doubling down on talking about the outcomes of what we do and the benefits we provide. And the real reason for that is because research, including from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has found that the sentiment of media coverage has impacted the likelihood for non-enrollees and high school students to attend college.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. It's, I mean, such important points there. And well, before I jump in, Carol, any reactions that you have to the study overall, or to some of the things that Teresa just shared?
Oh, if you're asking me to sort of follow on to Teresa, I think, it did out everything she said. I do think that we find ourselves in a familiar position of defending, excuse me, communications as the spear tip to actually values, decisions, policy, and leadership bent, and actually the actions that occur in the real world, which are not a communications issue. So it's a familiar place to be for everybody on this call. So I'd just say everything that she said is actually on point. And I also underscore that this is a moment. How much of an impact this moment has and what kind of tail it has is really yet to be seen. So I would take this with a measure, take a beat, do some more research, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about, and know that this is a data point or a set of data points in what is going to be a lot of similar ones over the next couple of years.
Yeah. So to address one thing that Teresa said, I mean, we did consider the notion of talking to current students, to talking to faculty and staff. The challenge there is, I think, one, we were seeing that this issue was having the decisions that were associated with these issues, I should say, the decisions that were associated with these issues, and then the response to those decisions, as you said, Teresa, we're having major issues with faculty, staff, and current students. And we did not feel like surveying those audiences or encouraging our clients to survey those audiences was the right path to go, unless there was definitive action that was going to be taken from those findings. And it feels very much like this is an issue that, we're not sure. I think there's a lot of folks right now that are hopeful that we're going to somehow come back to school in the fall and these things are not going to be there. The reality is they likely are going to be there, and there likely are going to be other issues. And that's when those audiences are going to expect some level of action, response, change in the way that things are being done. And a lot of that is still being formed right now. So, Carol, let me move to asking you something. What do you think are some of the key lessons from this data for higher ed leadership? What are kind of some of the key takeaways that you want, other folks that are sitting on the cabinet with you, or you want your institutional leaders, how can they use these insights to their advantage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm gonna have sort of two broad thoughts on it. One, it seems obvious, but I'm going to hammer it again. If you're not already doing so, begin serious longitudinal brand perception studies now. There is simply no other way to gauge the actual impact to your brand, your specific institution, other than to know what the baseline is. And if you've missed that window, create the baseline now. So that's incredibly important. And I think while some institutions, many on this call, many excellent colleagues, did likely take a specific hit to their brand, much of this data is talking about a hit more globally to higher education as a category, which really is a pile-on to the general, slide of trust that we've seen in the Gallup study and other places. And just like all politics is local, we hate Congress, but we love our local representative. It makes it that much more important to understand the delta between the broad sentiment on higher education and the specifics about your institution. And I would include alumni in those studies as well, because we tend to forget them, but they tend to be an enormous base, an important set of ambassadors. And also, if you lose credibility and trust with that group, it has a different set of risks to it. So I always advise, when you're doing these broad perception perception studies include your alumni base.
Mm-hmm.
Second thought, sort of in keeping with the moment that we're in, a sort of existential threat to the value proposition, I think higher ed has spent a lot of the last decade doing good work to understand how to better position our institutions on our points of difference, which has been an important exercise. I think it will be an important exercise. But in this moment, our whole value proposition is really being questioned. And we're not done, right? We know we're heading into a very volatile year. So the advice that I would give is to lean into the fundamentals at this moment, right? The lifetime value of a degree, the doorway to career and lives of success, value for cost, preparedness for a changing world, all of these things. Doing that, of course, in the authentic voice and tone of your own institutions and brands. But I think it's a swift and timely reminder of the need to also market on points of parity. At this moment, that is where we're going to win. And a sidebar, just to follow on to the comment about faculty, which could be an entire discussion. The dynamics between faculty and administration have really come to the surface through this whole last year. That when we do talk about the fundamentals, those really open up more avenues for faculty to feel supported, which is a good thing for us in this moment, in terms of mitigating the divide, right, within our own institutions heading into really volatile periods of time.
Teresa, let's revisit the specific schools, right? The schools that were mentioned, that were mentioned by both parents and prospects. It was the same set of 3 schools at the top.
Right.
And, all of those schools that were on the list that, were mentioned essentially more than 2% nationally all have kind of distinct brand experiences that are separate from these incidents. Carol was alluding to that. There are a couple of schools on this list that have kind of protest culture and as a big part of the DNA of their institution. What's your opinion on how lists like these, brand attributes like these, impact kind of the overall brand experience of higher ed, or even how that those institutions may be perceived?
So we talked about this on our planning call because that list of institutions lives rent-free in my head for a couple of different reasons. And the list is really focused on those universities who have strong brands and can weather the impact of critique, even if the storm is very, very painful, as we're seeing. They have recognition with or without us trying to pull them to the forefront of conversation. I worry about the reputational hit writ large for the industry and those without elite and well-ranked brands. And I wonder if they can overcome even slight hits to their admissions funnels these days. We're seeing a number of institutions that are really struggling going into this fall for enrollment. And even this week, we've had campuses say that they're going to be closing. So I would guess that those who have significant protest and encampment coverage and social shares are breathing a sigh of relief that this isn't sticking for them if they weren't on that list. And I think of it a bit differently, though. Don't breathe that sigh of relief yet. While I wouldn't want to be tied or have my brand tied to a negative, I would question why your brand wasn't strong enough for you to make it onto this list of very well-respected institutions, because it really is about location and it's about brand value. So I'm not suggesting institutions make themselves vulnerable just to be on a list, but I do think there is a real underlying reputation-based reason why people remembered these institutions at this time beyond the protests and the encampments. And I wish I could have asked a question of the students and the parents, and that question is, if you or your child got into this institution, would you enroll? And my guess is that most respondents would still attend because of the types of institutions that we're talking about. And my question for all of the attendees today and for all of you is to ask, would your overall brand be strong enough to have a similar experience and a positive enrollment fate?
Yeah, and it's interesting, even just in some of the recent, coverage of some things that have happened in response, right? Like I'm sure a lot of the attendees on this call heard the news about, I think it was almost 24 folks at the University of Texas from marketing communications roles that were let go. It was cited in direct response to some of the ways that crises were handled. There also was the news about some of the things at Emerson. And I think your point is a really, really good one, Teresa, which is like, even for some of the institutions where protests may have been smaller and not had any significant media coverage in any ways whatsoever. What did it look like for, a group of families that were visiting on campus that day?
Yes.
Or how were you able to recover within those moments? And I think we could do a whole bunch of slicing and dicing on some of the data, or if we would have had more representative, more numbers of responses from some metro areas. Like I said before, you may see, even if we're looking at one specific metro, like in your neck of the woods in Denver, right? Are we going to see what's the response going to look like in relation to CU Boulder versus the University of Denver versus any of the other
Right.
institutions that are in that area? In some ways, that question is an awareness question in the same way that we always see, large football programs being a proxy for awareness of schools with strong academic reputations, right? It's just
Right.
it's school that comes to mind.
Or
So,
even when you all ask those general framing questions of when you think of a quality institution, what institutions come to mind?
right.
That was your slide 7. It's that same
Yeah.
type of institution.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And I think, your point is a really, really important one for the schools that aren't on those lists to really, really be examining sort of some of the deeper impact here. Carol, do you think that there's going to be, a significant impact on enrollment for the schools, for schools that are kind of experiencing extensive media coverage here? Or
I think we will see a softening. I think the degree of significance is yet to be determined. And I don't think we understand enough about what the hits are that are geographically based, economically based, politically based, right? But I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't expect some potential for overall erosion of prospects who are probably on the bubble of deciding whether they will pursue college or not. And we've seen that group get larger and larger and larger. Not as a standalone issue, but kind of as a pile-on effect of lots of other issues that we've seen in terms of public erosion of trust, questioning, do I really need to go to college? Can I do something else? Can I get a vocation? Can I get other training? Is it worth the cost? Especially for students who are carrying the burden of that debt, for sure. But it's a pile-on. It's like sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, not a singular issue. So I think we can expect to see more of that erosion of the go to school, not go to not pursue college, particularly in that set. Right. I think that again, the specificity of like the degree to which ones at the top of our kind of proxy for the whole industry brands versus the rest of us are really dependent on the economics and the markets that we are in. I do think, though, that there's something that came in, which is fascinating, and a few of you picked it up, and it's in the comments as well, that there's a slide where we have the negative perception students, prospects, and parents. That is sort of higher education generally, likelihood to go to school, and then like negative perception of the individual institutions. That to me is one of the most interesting slides in this whole deck, partly because the negative reaction is higher for the prospects than it is for the parents. And we typically think of parents as more conservative, more upset by these kinds of things. And the students are actually more negative, more judgy, if you will, for those particular schools. But both things suggest to me is that we will likely see an additional filter put on the consideration set for schools that either parents want their kids to apply to or kids want to apply to for different reasons. Parents probably like, I'm not sending my kid, I don't, either the political context to say, I want to go to a place where whoever I identify, I'm going to feel comfortable that my kid is going to get a values-based or aligned and all that stuff. That's probably been happening for a while. I think it's likely to become more overt after this. And then from the prospect's perspective, a couple of you picked up on this, why it's negative may be very different. Parents may be, I'm not sending, it looks violent, out of control, I'm not sending my kid there. Kid be like, I don't like how the school treated its protesters.
Yeah.
Either way, I think there'll be an additional and more overt filter on the consideration set that we probably have been seeing a little bit of through the last few years, but now I think is really going to be tipped up into a more defined thing that we should probably study.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, such an important point. I think that, that distinct difference between how a parent and a prospective student get their news and information also plays dramatically into that difference that you're talking about. Because in general, the parents are hearing those things through media, traditional or non-traditional. The students are hearing it firsthand from friends who are either students who are involved in the protests or are trying to go to class during the protests,
Right.
right? Either one of those two things.
100%.
So again, it gets back to like what's being judged here. Is the
Yes.
institution being judged? Is its reputation? Is it its values? Or is it its response to the incident itself? And it's really, really complicated. And I think that prospects in some ways are much, much closer to that reality of those three things than parents may be, because they're hearing about it through more traditional media. They're hearing about it from other parents, those kinds of things. And so I think your point is a really, really good one.
And I just want to echo something that both of you had said, but Carol raised. And I think that when we look at that safety slide and that safety response, it's safety from whom or what. And this is a difference, I would guess, than what we would have seen previously, right? We would have been those who provided the safety. And I think we really need to dig in and see if, in specifically thinking about protests, the safety might also include from our institutions and us.
Yeah. Yep. Teresa, what kind of advice do you have for how schools should approach kind of applying some of these learnings to, like we were talking about before, whether it's these issues continuing to linger into the fall, or what's likely to be a really, really divisive election cycle,
Yeah.
and other kinds of issues that are gonna come up in the fall. How do we make things better here?
So I think this is really a great time for us to be doing some planning for us to kind of look at a number of different ways to slice and dice this. So I think it's a planning, preparing, updating, and adopting season. And here's kind of how I'm thinking about those. I think that the planning includes reviewing how the landscape expectations for higher education apply to our institutions. So most like to think about our missions. They like to think about those qualities that we share publicly about what we value, whether it's freedom of speech or academic freedom or democracy, whatever it might be, that we really try to say is what we do. How is our living of those elements actually being perceived? And I think there's also this institutional community values piece for us to be thinking about too. And that is how we should be talking about ourselves and how well that aligns with how others are thinking of us and how we portray ourselves. So that if we have an issue, it doesn't sound as if we're contradicting what we've always said is sacred and isn't at risk for being taken away. And I think determining how your communication strategy and approach looks this fall is going to be important, not just about statements, but also the larger picture, the larger audience perceptions, and also the measurement. What does success look like, and how are we going to be thinking about this? I think it's time to look through all of our planning documents, our policies, our procedures, and think about what this means for our leaders and have them ready for both feedback and critique this fall and help them to differentiate between the two. I think that we need to be thinking about how we're addressing holes, flaws, and weaknesses in what it is that we do, and communicating if we're changing anything, because we saw this at some of the institutions, that people shifted how they were doing things, but they didn't communicate it, but then held the community accountable and responsibility for something they may not have been aware of.
Yeah.
And I also think that we need to be looking at that holistic picture of how we're partnering with each other. Both of you said something that made me just pause, and that is that we need to be thinking about the industry value proposition, not just our own institutional value propositions, because I'm seeing some institutions that are saying, and we're not that. But when you're saying we're not that, the that you're talking about is still the ecosystem that you're in. So how do we focus on ourselves when we need to focus on ourselves, but also have each other's backs as an industry when we need to have that kind of approach as well.
Yeah, and I think, it's such a it's such a tricky thing to navigate. I think one of the things that kind of went really wrong is in some of that early testimony that was on Capitol Hill. Those institutional leaders tried to talk about the value system and failed to sort of recognize, the arena that they were operating in. I don't know if you want to react to that in any way, Teresa.
Absolutely. So I think that, and I would say our top three institutions have something really important in common, right? And that's that their presidents testified before Congress at different stages over the last few months. And that's not a coincidence. The initial congressional testimony by presidents, they approached that really as a question and answer opportunity. Questions were posed and they answered those questions. Rather than viewing it as the political theater that it really was, and as something that needed to be survived, not treated as a teachable moment because people had genuine curiosity about what it is that we do. So I think we need to become wiser to what is being asked of us and why it is being asked.
Yeah. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I know that we've got some questions through the chat and other places. Carrie, do you want to help us navigate here a little bit?
Sure. We had a really good one about the Ivy League schools. It seems that Ivy League schools absorb the brunt of negative protest coverage. Is this because they already operate under a microscope? There are consistent conversations around their perceived value or lack thereof, and the employment of questionable enrollment practices, for example. On a brand level, how do you prevent these issues from compounding?
Carol, Tressa, any thoughts on that?
These issues from compounding. I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I think there's two factors at least. One is that right or wrong, they stand as a proxy for the industry. So that provides an extra halo and an extra level of risk. And so as the farther we move up, and we all aspire to move higher in rankings, that risk goes up as well. So brand valuation and equity and all that stuff is not just a sort of thing that goes endlessly up and to the right? It also carries risk with it. I think there was the second half of that question. And Teresa, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I'll go to the first part while we get to think about the second part. And I would say part of why we see the Ivy League institutions represented is because we know of them, right? For many, many different reasons. And they're aspirational in many, many ways. And I hear this from reporters and outlets quite often. And people click on stories about them. In part, it's because we want to be like them, so we click on them. It's in part because others recognize the names and they click and want to know more. But all of us collectively are telling outlets, reporters, members of the public, these are the institutions to watch.
Carrie, want to add the second part there?
Sure. I think you all covered it. It talked about the Ivy League schools and, the coverage around them. And if it's because they're already operating under a microscope, and how do you prevent those issues from compounding? So I think we're good on that question. Carol,
the only thing that I would maybe add to it is that there's no question that they were targeted, right? For exactly the reasons that we're talking about here. So I think that that's where the reputational risk comes in. Like the higher you go in that scale, the more that you're going to be a proxy for issues. Societal issues, or it is issues on the industry itself.
But I also think too, I mean, here we are again, casting a broad brush, right? Where we're saying the Ivy League schools. The reality is it was only 3 to 4 schools among the Ivy League schools that were mentioned, right? And referenced, and especially towards the top of that list. And, getting back to the substance of the issue and how people dealt with and responded, again, may be the thing that, kept or did not keep some of these institutions, at top of mind when we're asking those types of things. And also, what the coverage actually looked like. So, we know that Harvard and Penn were among the early institutional leaders who testified in front of Congress. That drove a ton of media activity. Then there were fallout related to those institutional leaders, which kept that in the news cycle. And so, we start to associate that then with a broader set of institutions of that level of status, and that then paints this broader brush. So there's complexity in both the detail of the analysis and the research, but there's complexity in the coverage of the issues as well.
There's one more question that came up in the chat that I think is really interesting. And it's kind of posing the question of how we talk to our clients about if they're facing campus protests and they want to pause their marketing and advertising right now. What would be our advice to them in this time, and how would we handle that?
So I'd like to think that there's a simple answer here, but there's not a simple answer, is the reality. So the first foundational place to start is to definitively, not qualitatively or not navel-gazingly, know if you are being associated with these types of issues, regardless of this specific issue or not. Are you in the news? Are people actually thinking about you or not? Knowing that definitively before you either positively or negatively impact a decision around jumping in or jumping out of a news cycle, right? Like that's a key and important part. I think another key and important part and foundational thing is, I hope that you were doing brand work before, and I hope that you are intending to do brand work afterwards, because both of those things will have impact on your reputation over the long term. As I know that we're preaching to the choir a bit here, but reputations aren't built through single campaigns. They're not built through single one-time media investments. And it makes decisions in these moments easier. The really tactical response there is, if you're in the midst of a big campus crisis, you should not be confusing the market and diluting your message and diluting your investment by trying to communicate other things at the same time that you're in a major crisis, right? Yeah. So, if we were working with an institution that was running a bunch of media, even if it was targeted towards specific audiences, and they were in the midst of a big issue like this, I think we would recommend to pause any level of spending until we could evaluate, sort of where we are in that news cycle and the crisis cycle, and how we begin to kind of come out of that. Carol, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sorry. I think you're dead on right. I think there are moments when all of us have likely gone dark for a small period of time, but I think the risk of continuing that blackout period is significant. And it's a kind of overcorrection that I think Teresa was also talking about. Like, this is a moment, this is a data point. The sun comes up tomorrow morning. We need to get the next class seated and the work of the university goes on. And I think that signals a lot to our constituencies. And they're watching for consistency as much as anything else. So I think, look at the levers, look at the nuance, or maybe some creative you want to adjust, but keep those adjustments, be exercise restraint, right? And avoid a pendulum swing, because that's going to create a whole set of new issues for us.
Right. And I think thinking about brand, go ahead.
I think if you take the very long view is that brands are built because of trust and authenticity.
That's where I was going to go.
And I think what that means is that higher education is in a real crisis moment of trust and authenticity. And so, if you weren't communicating about your brand, what I would hate to see is that, whether you're at a small institution that wound up getting a lot of media coverage because of some issues on your campus, or you're at a large institution, that you all of a sudden think that you're going to communicate or advertise yourself out of this issue.
Right.
That is not going to happen. And that is not a wise investment in the short term or in the long term, right? This is not the time to open up that funnel.
Well, and I'm going to expand a little bit more on that, Jason, because brand includes trust and authenticity. I would add image, reputation, and relationships. And that means that you may not be doing some of the paid stuff that you're talking about, but you can still have an audience specific approach where you lean into relationships, you lean into reputation and image in different ways. So this is really where we have to do our jobs, not just perhaps in the way that we might have planned it, but instead in the ways that we strategically need to focus.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer, Jason.
Sorry, people at the doorbell. Let's see. Is there another question, Carrie, or anything else that we...
That was all the questions that we received. And thank you Mary, for providing answers in the chat as well.
Okay. Terrific. Well, thank you to everybody for joining us. It's been an action-packed hour. As I mentioned before, if you have any additional questions or you're kind of curious on anything related to the specifics of your institution, feel free to follow up with us. Thank you so much, first and foremost, to our team and the work there, as well as to Teresa, to Carol for joining us. We appreciate your time and all of the work that you've done to make this happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.